All right, joining us now here on In the Circle on D1 Softball. If you've gone to D1Softball.com on the rankings page, or even if you're a baseball fan, if you've gone on D1Baseball.com, you may have noticed a ranking system of the DSR, which is known as the Diamond Sports Ranking. And people have certainly got a lot of positive feedback since we've talked about it on the site, on respective D1 Softball and, of course, on D1 Baseball. But people have asked, what is it? How does it work? Well, we've got the people that know the answers to that. And it's not me, but these people are a lot smarter than me. The man who is in charge of the DSR, who's created it, Forrest Allen, is with us. And also with us, former Troy head coach, somebody who's been around the game for a long time and used to be on this podcast, as a matter of fact, is making a return in a different role, helping out with DSR, is Beth Mullins joining us here on the program. Thanks to both of you for joining us here.
Yeah, thanks for having us, man.
Yeah, it's super fun.
All right, Forrest, I'm going to ask you the first question, the most obvious question. Explain to the audience, what is DSR?
So DSR, Diamond Sports Rankings, is what we consider to be a modern alternative to RPI. So about this time every year, everyone starts casting stones at RPI, saying that, oh, my team ranked too high, my team's ranked too low. And that's a constant refrain. We've been hearing it for a very long time. But what we haven't heard for a very long time is, what are you going to use instead? And so this project came about organically within 643, because we were doing the same thing everyone else does. We were complaining about it, and me being new to the company and not knowing any better, said, well, why don't we make one of our own, right? I mean, that's every kid's pet peeve, is when they complain to their parents and their parents say, well, what are you going to do about it? So I heard my mom in my ear. So I naively said, let's make a new one. And they said, you think you can do that? And I said, yeah, I just got this fancy degree from a prestigious university. Let's take it for a spin, see what it can do. And so, and that's how it came about. And so what we think we've done is created something that's not radically different from RPI, in terms of, you're not going to find huge things, but we feel like we've emphasized the things that need to be emphasized. We understand, again, having people like Beth and our CEO, Derek Weldon, who's a former D1 baseball coach, right? They were able to ground the data in practicalities that make this thing useful.
Now, give us a couple of examples where it's different than the RPI.
Sure.
In the formula there, that makes a significant difference, and perhaps a more accurate portrayal of that team versus what they're portrayed as in the RPI. Because you're right, you nailed it. This is the time of year where people are nipping, like, how did that team move up in the RPI when they, where they lost some ground even though they won? And there's always this confusion every year right around this time with this formula. How does DSR differentiate? A couple examples from the RPI that way.
Yeah, great thing, great question. And so what we think about is, at a high level, the RPI consists of, your record, your opponent's record, and your opponent's record, right? And so the distribution of that is 75% of it is your opponent's and 25% of it's you, right? So whether that's your opponents or your opponent's opponents, right? That struck me as the wrong way to evaluate a team. If I'm a team and I want to be evaluated, I want to be evaluated based on what I'm doing. But because we have 306 teams in our sport, right, who you play, it still matters. So what we did was we tried to flip that ratio on its head. So DSR still considers strength of schedule the same way that RPI does, just in a less, it's less important. And we also make a key difference in how we calculate strength of schedule. What RPI does on their strength of schedule, it's designed to be correct at the end of the season. And what I mean by that is, if you play a team early in the season and they're very good, for example, right? You play a 5-0, Baylor, or a 5-0 Texas, right? Florida State, someone that's good. And then they end up becoming and then they have some key injuries, right? And they fall off and they end up with a sub 500 record. What DSR does is it tries to, so let me back up. RPI will just say whatever the team finishes with, that's what you get credit for in your strength of schedule. So this team that fell apart at the end of the year due to key injuries ends up with a winning percentage less than 500. The team that beat them early in the year when they were at full strength, that win is going to become less and less valuable as that team loses. But when you're evaluating my team and what we did, all this stuff is happening months after we played them. And so, as you guys both know, I mean, Eric, nobody follows this closer than you do. You know that a team in May is different than a team in February. They could be a lot better or they could be a lot worse, right? You've got young freshmen that grow up over the course of the season and they're much better. You lose people to injury, and so you're much worse. And so what DSR does is it values the win at the time the game was played against the caliber of that team at that time. And so the value of that win does not change over the course of the season, where RPI changes quite a bit over the course of the season. That's a big difference in terms of how we calculate and how important strength of schedule is. The other big difference is that that DSR considers margin of victory. I think intuitively, as fans of college baseball and college softball, we know that a 10-run victory is different than a 1-run victory. And that is a key piece of data that DSR uses to distinguish teams from one another. And so we wanted to be very careful as to not create an incentive for, we'll call it unsportsmanlike conduct, right? We don't want to run up a score and give people excuses to do that. And so we essentially did two things. One was we capped it at 10 runs. So if you win by 10 or you win by 30, you get the same amount of DSR points. And then the other thing is it's not a straight line. It's more of a curve. And so the difference between winning by 8 and by 9 is significantly less than the difference between winning by 2 versus 1. And so those, I think, are the biggest differences in RPI and Diamond Sports Rankings.
I want to bring in Beth here for your perspective on how'd you get involved? How'd you first learn about DSR? And what sold you on DSR? Because you have a unique perspective. You've been a head coach. You've been an assistant. So you know what it's like from the coaching standpoint, from the dugout, and how to create a schedule and things like that. So tell me your side of this, because you obviously got involved with DSR and you believe in the DSR is the right way to go. So just tell us from your perspective.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And I had joined 643 back in June. So a little less than a year ago, and Forrest is already part of the team. So, when we have our team meetings, creating this new ranking system, I kind of learned why, which Forrest has kind of alluded to. But being a part of a team and hearing, hey, we are going to actually try to solve this problem. And then being a part of that process and realizing that we can solve it and make it a very data-driven solution, was just amazing, because I think a lot of coaches are frustrated or whatever, but you don't know how to fix it. And you don't have the tools, you don't have the smart people that I am blessed to, work with, that have the solution. And so being a part of that and literally saying, all right, hey, Forrest, hey, Rick, this is my thoughts. And them just, it's a recipe. You put different amounts of seasoning here and a different amount of here, and them doing that, but being completely data-driven was just amazing to me, because I do believe you can complain all you want, but if you don't have a solution for it, you can't go anywhere. So I think this is a great solution to a problem that I believe coaches have been having for a while now.
Well, and it's a problem. I mean, the RPI was originally created for basketball, but basketball's gotten rid of it. They are now using a net, which has its own flaws, which they're apparently, and that's one thing to mention. There's never going to be a perfect system. Everybody's 100 going to be unanimously agree. But I've always been a fan of the more data we could have, the better. But I've always, we've had the committee chairperson since 2021 on the podcast, and one of the questions I bring up is, well, if basketball doesn't believe that the RPI is a good metric to decide to pick your field for the tournament, why is it good enough for the other sports? And the common answer I've gotten in their defense, it's all they know is that's all we have to work with for now. Now, since then, for this year, they're doing this thing called the KPI, which is the Kevin Ponga Index. We've had Kevin Ponga, full disclosure, on the show in the past, so I am familiar with that. Remains to be seen. I hope to ask the committee chairperson this year about the reaction to that. But I think the more information, the better. But you're right, Beth, and I want you to expand on this. It is a frustrating formula, the RPI, because from a scheduling standpoint, it's kind of unpredictable to some extent, where you might play a certain team that you think is going to be really good for your schedule, but maybe they have a down year, so you don't get the credit for that all of a sudden. And now you get hurt by that, even though back in August and November and January, wow, that looks like a marquee game. I mean, I don't want to single out examples this year out of respect to the program, but it happens everywhere, every year. So it seems like one of the things I like about the DSR is you're not able to trick the system, because there is other ways to trick the system in the RPI, which has been also a common conversation. But it also, you don't have to play these guessing games of the scheduling. Right? Is that one of the things you like about this from the DSR?
Yeah, and just from a coaching perspective, and the thing I don't think many people know, because very few people are coaches, there's very few coaches out there. You schedule almost more than a year ahead of when you play. So in January, coaches are scheduling for the next year, for 2025. I think people think that you schedule a month, you're scheduling in the fall for the spring. You're not. You have your conference, and then you're scheduling all your other stuff a year before you even start 2024. You're scheduling for 2025. And so that was, with RPI, you do the best you can. I mean, coming from a longtime mid-major coach, you really do the best you can I know my conference's relative strength of schedule, but how am I going to get this where I need to have it for RPI to have us be in the race for at the end? And you just never know. And so you could do a great job, and teams are consistent where they were a year ago. But I think with the portal and the way softball, everything is now, I think it's a very unknown. So this is a much more stable. It's not 75% based off of your opponents and things that are completely out of your control. It's based on winning. Like, win your games and you gain points, lose your games and you lose points. And yes, win quality is a huge part of it. So your opponent does come into factor of how strong they are when you play them, but it just doesn't completely take scheduling and you either win or lose on that. So that's what I love of just having experienced it and done it right and done it wrong year to year. It's, I think for coaches, a lot easier to schedule and have a great schedule and know that your ability to win those games is what is going to move you in the rankings.
No doubt. And Forrest, one of the things that when we first met that stood out to me, and I'll bring it up here, the DSR is more fair to programs like Boston, Miami of Ohio. I'm just going to throw those two as an example because they're really good teams. I think Miami, Ohio showed that against Oklahoma across the country. We've had Karen Kumar on the show and talk about how good they are. They now become a perennial NCAA tournament team. So has Ashley Waters and Boston. But the reality is, with the RPI, they are handcuffed on how far they're limited. Like the Patriot League, with as respect as we can be to the Patriot League, is going to hold them down, just like the MAC Conference is going to hold Miami of Ohio down. Those are just two examples. There's more of that. And they're at a disadvantage. It's really an advantage to, quite frankly, the powered leagues. Explain how the DSR kind of eliminates some of that, because I know that was part of your thinking when you came up with the DSR, is creating that balanced field to judge who is the best teams regardless of what conference they're in and things that they can't control, like the conference you're playing in.
Sure. And that was, one of the things that I think helped make this ranking system so good was having Beth's experience as a mid-major coach. Because what she would talk about is, the only part of the schedule that she controlled at Troy was their non-conference, which makes sense, right? So she goes out and plays a really tough non-conference schedule, does very well. So, come conference season, she's very well position in RPI. But now she has to go and play in the Sun Belt, which, from a strength of schedule standpoint, is not the SEC. It's not the ACC. It may be this year, but historically, right? And so now, never mind the fact that Beth runs her opponents off the field. Just by the fact that she steps onto the field with them, her RPI drops, because the distribution of strength of schedule versus outcome is, I think, misaligned. And so what we wanted to do is try to create a system that rewards winning rather than simply playing. And so, as Beth alluded to earlier, one of the most important features in DSR is how good is the opponent that you played. And so we quantify that, and we give each team a win quality score. So that's essentially how good your opponent is. And there's several things that go into that, like winning percentage and strength of schedule, and something that's called Pythagorean record for all the aspiring sabermetricians out there. It's a formula that creates what I call a should be winning percentage based off how many runs you score and how many runs you allow. And so all those things go in to create that. And so again, the better the team that you beat, the higher that score is going to be. Then it takes into account, the margin of victory that we talked about earlier. It takes into account whether you played that game at home or on the road. And so ultimately DSR, you only, as Beth alluded to, right, you only get points when you win. So when Ashley and her Terriers go and play a Patriot League game, they win. So they win more often, a lot more often than they lose. But if they're playing somebody at the bottom of the league, they don't get very many points because that team has a low quality score. And the other input that I neglected to mention earlier is win expectancy. And that's that's the second most important component, because the idea is if you beat someone that you should beat, right, you've got an 85 to 90% probability of beating that team. Well, that's not going to get you very many points, right? You kind of did what you should do, and you took care of business, et cetera. And so that essentially kind of maintains the status quo and just moves you up a little bit. However, if you beat a team that you've got a 20% chance of beating, right, that becomes a much bigger swing in the points. And so again, teams like, Miami of Ohio and BU, who you referenced, right, they will move up DSR rankings kind of slow, and they're the tortoise, right? They're slow and steady wins the race. And so they're winning all the time, but they're not getting very many points as they do it. So they'll be there when they need to be come selection time. Whereas, teams that play in a Big 12 or an SEC, you go on the road and, you beat a Tennessee, you go on the road and you beat an LSU, right? That's going to be a big swing in points because that win quality is going to be very high. Chances are you're probably not favored to beat them, so your win expectancy will be low, and those are ingredients that are going to cause big jumps in there. And so again, one of the things that we wanted to do was try and get away from coaches being able to schedule their way into a tournament bid. And then the other thing that I thought about too, and Derek Weldon, who used to coach at Tennessee Tech, made this point to me, was as you get later in the season and you play those midweeks in May and in April, because a Tennessee their RPI would suffer by playing Derek's Tennessee Tech team. All of a sudden, somebody's sick, or the bus breaks down, or there is a piece of a cloud in the sky 40 miles away. So, guy canceled the game, right? And that's bad for our sport, right? Because when you're recruiting at places like Tennessee Tech, and maybe Beth can speak to this at Troy, it's right. Hey, you're going to play the best teams in the country. Even if you come to a smaller school, we play the Alabamas, we play the Tennessees, right? All these things. But then because RPI penalizes that big school for even playing you, they end up canceling the game. And I actually had a head coach at a Power 5 school tell me that's exactly why I canceled games. He's like, I don't say it out loud, But that's exactly why I cancel games, because I can't afford to take the RPI hit.
Well, we're seeing that a lot in baseball, and we're seeing some of that in softball. We've seen that over the years where teams buy out a team out of a game because it doesn't help their resume, Beth. And I think, Beth, it's interesting because one thing I've learned since I've covered softball and doing the bracketology, I've done it for a decade, is, and this comes, and I'm not taking shots at anybody in particular on this, but it is reality. Softball is the one sport that seems to reward teams that finish near the bottom or last in a conference, major conference, to make the tournament over mid-majors teams that are really good. You don't see the last place team in the SEC make the tournament in men's or women's basketball, or even baseball for that matter, as Forrest could speak to. Softball, we've had this situation where the SEC's gotten every team in, or gotten 11, 12 teams in, and they were arguing, well, this is about the best teams in the field. They're going to go to 15 teams now. So I think my concern with the RPI is the mid-major component, because the Sun Belt, which you coached at, Beth, has been consistently a top 7 league at minimum. And could be, again, a 3-bid league, but do they get squeezed out because the RPI favors a certain formula? It seems like DSR cancels that. But speak to that battle that you had to deal with and your fellow colleagues, mid-major head coaches like the Sun Belt, the Americans, another example, and there's other examples, that have to compete against these power conferences that there's really no restrictions on how many teams they get into the field, really.
Yeah, and I mean, I was, I coached at Mississippi State for a while too, and so I've been in Power Fives and I've been, at mid-major. So I understand both arguments. So that's the unique part of me, is because I do understand the argument that, maybe a team that finishes near the bottom of the SEC, when you look at their schedule, it is still really good. I mean, they're above if they're above 500, and then you put their schedules side to side inside the RPI system, the 4 quads quadrant system that RPI is, it stands up. So I do understand that inside the RPI, it's what I love about DSR is it's a lot more, can't think of the word. It shows its work for every game. You can literally see a time series of a Sun Belt team versus an ACC team and see them ride the season. And every game you can hover and see all the data of why that team got this many points, where they got the points, what the run differential was, everything. So it shows its work compared to RPI. So I would like to see the arguments through DSR when of those two teams matched up against each other, because I think showing your work will give that answer a lot more than RPI. When it comes to Sun Belt, I'm a Sun Belt advocate. I mean, Texas State right now, I cannot wait. I mean, Ricky Woodard and what they're doing, and right now, whether you're talking about DSR or RPI, they're in a place of, possible hosting. So I think, all that data driven, I think these Sun Belt teams should be rewarded for the seasons they're having. And I think the back half of the Sun Belt and seeing where they go relative to DSR and relative to RPI, and I think they'll maybe stay more steady inside DSR than they are in RPI. So that might have not answered your question correctly, but I do see both sides of it. I just would like to see the sides of it inside DSR and not the arguments inside the RPI system, which I think is tough.
Yeah, I think the DSR helps determine if the 12th place SEC team is indeed better than the second or third base. Whereas,
exactly.
My issue with the RPI is, and I'll use this as a pun intended deal, but the 12th place SEC team gets more at-bats to improve their resume, if that makes sense, within the conference. I'll get case in point, UCF 2 years ago, when they hosted, a lot of things had to go their way because they only had certain amount of quality games within the American that year with Wichita and South Florida. Meanwhile, teams around them are playing quality games every year. So you almost, if you're a UCF perspective, you're rooting for other teams to do the work for you, help you, because even though you can win out, you can get caught, which is bizarre to say. The other example would be, again, a team like UCF last year finished the season against Memphis, who had a down year, was in the 200 RPI. By playing those games, they went from being pretty much a lock to make the tournament to a bubble team, even though they won every game. But it hurt their RPI so bad that they dropped to a bubble team to the point where if they would have lost in the conference tournament, they may not have gotten in. that's kind of the issue there is you even get punished sometimes when you win. And I think was brought up earlier, you're better off getting a rain out or a snowed out, which is really strange to say, but it is true that you're
Yeah,
better. It's bizarre.
yeah, absolutely. And to Beth's point about transparency, which may have been that
That's the
word,
word.
that word that was escaping her. The point about transparency, even if you did have a transparent RPI, it's always changing, right? Because my opponent played somebody, and then my opponent's opponent played somebody, and that record's always changing. So it's really hard to have a transparent RPI system, even if you wanted to. And that's one of the things that Beth and Derek and Rick all were harping on me about, was like, if you're going to do this, it has to be transparent. Like, people have to understand, because that's part of the frustration with RPI, right? It's one of those things where you don't like it for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons you don't like it because you don't understand it. And so at least with this system, right, we can say, here are the 4 inputs, right? How good is the team? Win expectancy. Were you on the road or not? And how many did you win by? And those have different weights, but right. And then you say, well, how do you determine the win expectancy, right? There's a handful of things that go into that. And again, when you change your podcast to nerdcast and stats, we can go into all those things, but for the sake of your listeners, I'll spare you that. But it's all there. It's all there. And again, I think and Beth referenced she made a reference or a recipe reference earlier. And I think that's a really good thing, because as a data scientist, right, you're trained to say what the right answer is, right? You can say, how far am I off with my prediction? Guess what? With rankings, there is no right answer. It's only right when people like Eric and Beth don't laugh you out of the room when you show your rankings, right? And so that was really hard for me, because in developing this system, I couldn't have done it without Beth, because I would come to her and I would say, what do you think of this? And she's like, no, your spreadsheet's wrong. And it's like, no, it's right. And she's like, no, this team's too high, this team's too low, right? And again, with decades of experience in this, she could help me contextualize. And then I got to say, and then I pressed her on it. I was like, well, why? Tell me why Boston University is too high. They win 50 games, right? She's like, well, you got to look at the Patriots. And it's okay. So it was a really helpful, kind of give and take, but it was a very interesting problem for me, because there's no right answer.
It's very tricky. I think the other thing that this does too is I think it helps the game. Let's put resumes aside. I remember a couple of years ago, and I'm going to use the baseball example because this was in the state where I live in. Kevin O'Sullivan in Florida, I guess the word on the street was, they put out there was, we're not going to play a road game in the state unless you're Florida State and Miami. Otherwise, you're coming to our place if you want to play a game. In other words, if you're a mid-major, those are our ground rules.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've seen, and I just took notice this year, I didn't realize baseball has changed to tweak the RPI formula way different. I don't know. Have you seen it, Forrest?
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that? Because I was I was blown away by the drastic differences, and I don't know how I feel about it, because it feels like they went almost the other way, where almost nobody gets punished, I feel like, after they lose a game. It was just explain for the audience may not be here. Softball has not tweaked it, but baseball did, to the point, and I think part of it was to encourage, for example, those in-state games that are so important to still get played. Because I think the growing concern around baseball, and I think perhaps it might flow over to softball, would be, do we stop seeing in-state matchups being played because it hurts our resume?
Yeah. And so the tweak that you're referring to was a change to give to make a win on the road more valuable than a win at home. And so because Sully is in a position where he can say, we will not play you unless you come to our place. So that's one instance. But the other instance was, and I talked to another, head coach at a mid-major school who lives in the northern part of the country. He said, we can't play games in February here. And so in order for me to get my 50 games, I got to go to places where it's not awful to try to play baseball in the middle of February. And so I end up playing a much less balanced schedule. And so as a way to help make that okay for those northern coaches and those northern teams, they said, well, what if we give you more credit? And so I think the tweak was the RPI was worth, a win on the road was like 3-1, worth like 3 times as much as a win at home. And that seemed very arbitrary to us, right, as a data-driven company. And so what we did was we went through and we said, historically, how often does a home team win? And fortunately for us, we've got the data to do that. And it turns out that in both baseball and softball, the home team wins about 60% of the time. And so when we were calculating that, we said a win on the road is worth 110%, and a win at home is worth 100%, and then a neutral site win is you split the difference and it's worth 105% of the value. So again, what we have to do is be transparent and say, well, why is a win on the road worth 1.1? Well, just because 10%, there's a 10% better chance that you would win at home than if you were playing on the road.
Yeah, that was a drastic change, to say the least, and that trying to encourage games being played on the road, neutral sites, right, Coach Beth? How hard is that to schedule teams to come to a park if you are at a mid-major, if you're Troy and South Alabama in softball, for example, to draw marquee games at home consistently versus, I got to go on the road and get those quality wins or go to a tournament, a neutral site?
Honestly, it's hard for me to complain because I was in the middle of SEC and ACC country, so it was not hard for me.
Very drivable, very beneficial.
Very drivable. Georgia Tech, Auburn, Alabama, all of them within 2 hours, to get to you. So I was lucky, but we'll bring BU up. Boston, not easy. Not easy to get people, whether it's because of weather or just location. It's hard to get people to you. And so you are penalized because you are going on the road more than anybody. So we do have that cooked in now. So that does reward Boston now for going on the road because they have to. It's an uncontrollable. And I keep thinking about the uncontrollable things. There are a lot of uncontrollables to where you are, what conference you're in, all of that. And I think RPI rewards those uncontrollables or values them too much, and DSR values them much more accurately and rewards, if you're on the road, because it's something you have to do and you win, then you get a little extra points there. So I think it's just according to your location. I was lucky, not all coaches, and we'll bring, Kieran up at Amaya, Ohio. She's done a wonderful job, despite the fact that she probably is on the road the first 3 or 4 weeks. So it's impressive what they've done up there.
So
uncontrollable is a great word, by the way. Uncontrollable is a great word. That's a fantastic word to describe that. Continue, Forrest.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to build a little bit off of what Beth said, and again, leveraging sometimes you get fortunate with expertise like Beth, but sometimes you just get lucky because 2 of our team members live in Iowa, and they both played college baseball and college softball in Iowa, and there's just not a lot of programs there, right? And when you're a resource constrained company or a resource constrained team, you can't buy 25 plane tickets to go to Florida or Arizona, right? And so you're like, I play in Iowa, like I can't really go. There just aren't teams for me to play. So even if I could get Oklahoma to come, they won't come to me. And so it was just really interesting to think about and hear coaches at the conventions talk about, I don't have the budget to get on an airplane and fly. So even, hey, we're willing to play any team, anywhere, anytime. That's what every coach says, but there is a fiscal reality that says, you don't have a budget to do that. So this was, again, another way to recognize that not all teams can go play the schedule that they want for a variety of reasons. And so again, if you do have to travel and you do have to play a team that you may not otherwise want to play, as long as you win, you'll move up.
No doubt. And a couple things, and Beth can probably, I think, can if you tell me if I'm wrong in this, I feel like softball coaches, for the most part, understand the importance of traveling, getting a bus trip and playing a midweek game on the road against maybe a school that's a mid-major, whatever. There's not as much politicking or drama that it comes with maybe some of the other sports. Is that accurate to say? I mean, I feel like everybody understands. I mean, I'm not saying it's 100%. There's probably exceptions, but I don't sense it like it was in baseball, for example, where there is a lot more politicking and, hey, the coaches maybe don't get along and stuff like that. Feels like it happens more in baseball than softball.
Yeah, I definitely did experience that. I was, again, very lucky and, surrounded by a lot of great programs and great coaches. So, but I also think midweeks are very different for baseball than softball.
Absolutely.
So, like softball, with the pitching situation alone, they're very different sports in general. And which is why some of the recipes are just slightly different when you're talking about softball or baseball, because there are some slight differences with the pitching. But those midweeks mean a little different, or you approach them different in softball than you do baseball. So I think there's less politicking. Like, let's go play, because we can both throw our best pitchers if we want to.
Correct.
You can.
Correct. And obviously, in fairness, by the way, to Kevin O'Sullivan, that was never a public thing. It was just the word on the street. Plus, he's gone on since and has played road games. I don't want to make sure aggregators and all that misconstrued. He's been playing games since then. Basketball's had that issue with politicking as well. But Beth clearly wants to host this podcast for us, because she brought up a point I was about to ask you about, which is the pitching angle on this. Because this is the most... So Beth clearly has a future as a podcast host. So now I know if I'm not available, who can host the show. But I do want to ask about the pitching, because she just brought up some of the differences there. And I do want to ask you that, because that is something that popped in my head, is do the value of a win depending on who the pitcher is. I'll use both sports as an example. Baseball, obviously, as Beth just brought up, a Friday night game or even a weekend game in general in college baseball is drastically different than a midweek baseball game, which, quite frankly, and I don't think any baseball coach would take offense to this, has become, let's just throw our staff an inning or two and get some work in. For most schools, not everybody, but for most schools. They're not throwing their ace on a Wednesday. They're saving them for Friday night baseball. So there's a difference in the pitching from that standpoint. I will bring this to softball. We don't have that, as Beth brought up. But I do think there's differences in softball. For example, I'll use South Alabama as a great example. Beth probably, if she doesn't sleep well, it's because she has Olivia Lackey in her nightmares from facing her. But as good as South Alabama is, they're a different team when she pitches than when she's not. And that's not a knock on anybody. It's really a compliment on how great she is. So I guess my question to you is that taken into consideration any formula as far as DSR, as far as the pitching value of a team and who they're throwing and who they beat in softball and versus also in baseball? I'll throw both sports there.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that you touched on something that it was probably that issue, along with margin of victory, was probably one of the most contentious things that we talked about as part of creating this ranking system. And how do you deal with that, right? People got very nervous about including margin of victory because, again, we didn't want to run up the score, and maybe not everyone would take the time to investigate the fact that, a 2-1 is different than 9-8, right? They're both 1-1 victories, but it's different. So what we ended up deciding on was, for baseball, that we would consider the day of the week that it was played. And you say day of the week, but I think you guys just made the point very eloquently, is that a Friday night game is different than a Wednesday afternoon game or a Wednesday night game. And so we had this, and so essentially the day of the week is a proxy for the quality of the starting pitcher that day. And so that's really what we're trying to capture by considering day of the week, because we don't really have a great way to sort of take into account the individual, right? We don't know ahead of time, and so do you take his ERA, or do how do you do that, right? And so that gets to be more subjective, right? Which we want to move away from. And so so that's what we did. So we ended up including it for baseball, but not for softball. And I had more than one person tell me, you need to include the pitcher. You need to consider the pitcher, especially when you're doing win expectancy, when that's one of your major things, right? Because as you say, South Al's a different team, with her on the mound, right? Stanford's another great example, right? Everybody's got an ace. Not everyone has an ace pitcher, but everybody knows that when Canby pitches for Stanford, that's just a different team. And so they said, you got to consider that. And so we thought about it, and ultimately what was most impactful for me in trying to decide what to do or not was I looked at last year's SEC Pitchers of the Year in both softball and baseball. And on the baseball side, it was Paul Skeens. He was the #1 overall pick in the Major League Baseball draft. He'll probably make his debut for the Pirates later this year. Right. On the softball side, it was Matty Pinta, and at Auburn. And so what I did was I said, what percentage of Auburn's innings did Matty pitch in? And what percentage of LSU's innings did Paul Skeens pitch in? Turns out Matty Pinta pitched 66% of all the innings that Auburn played. One person, right? Paul Skeens pitched 20% of the innings that LSU played. So ultimately, what we decided was that we would not consider the starting pitcher in there, because one person can pitch, for in Auburn's case, 2/3 of your innings. So trying to distinguish between someone who pitches 2/3 and then the rest of the staff, which pitches 1/3. So it's something we want to, this is the first year that we back tested it, but this is the first year we've shown it to the public, and are certainly open to to feedback on it. So that is the biggest difference between the softball version of DSR and the baseball version of DSR, because as you and Beth both know, right, they are different sports, and we want to recognize the differences and treat them accordingly.
And Eric, just to piggyback off of Forrest right there, and this is an RPI driven, I think, thing, but to the pitching point, and we brought up Texas State and South. Jessica Mullins and Olivia Lackey have pitched the most innings in college softball this year so far. And so they are throwing a lot of those midweeks. And so you can't just assume that a Friday starter, like in baseball, is not going to throw those midweeks. Like, they are throwing those in softball. So if you start weighting them different in softball right now, again, that's just a good example of those two right there, because they are different. They are. No,
it's a lot. Softball is still a lot harder, and while there's definitely been more and more schools and programs going by staffs and and things like that, you still have Georgina Corrick, South Florida, a couple of years ago was a great example of how drastically different they are when Corrick versus not. But they pitch almost, as Forrest brought up the stats, it is different. Whereas baseball, it's much more defined. You pretty much know that you're not going to throw a weekend guy. I would say 98% of the time, you're not going to throw a weekend guy in the midweek. The only teams that do that is a mid-major that knows, I need this midweek game, so I'm going to actually shuffle my rotation. I've seen that happen, where a mid-major is going to shuffle their staff to throw up a weekend guy on a Wednesday because they need that midweek game more, and maybe they have a weak non-conference game in the weekend, or whatever. That's when I see it, but very rare. Baseball, it's a lot more easier to identify than softball, which is a little more blurry to the point that both of you are making there.
And I think I'll just I want to add one more point. It was you had some people who wanted to say, like, midweeks in baseball just don't matter. Like, you just shouldn't even consider them. And I'm like, Well, then now you're curtailing the mid-majors ability to move up in the rankings, right? If you're gonna penalize me because I play in a weaker conference, then when I do schedule a game against a big Power 5 team, right now you're gonna say the game's worthless? Like, no. So what we ended up doing was for us, midweeks are worth 85% of the value of a Friday night game. So the number of points you would have won if the game was played on Friday it's only 15% less than if you win it on Wednesday. So we tried to balance this idea of giving mobility to the mid majors, who do go out and schedule really good tough programs, so that they can move up, because every weekend they've got to play their conference schedule.
The other thing that's tricky is sometimes who you think is the ace, somebody else develops, they become the ace, and then the other person is number two. So that's another reason why it's a little harder to do in various sports on there. Let me ask you this, because obviously a lot of people are listening to this. You're listening to the value of a game early in the season and all that. And the question I think people would ask you is, well, then how do you value an opening day game? How do you value opening weekend? How do you value, for example, week 2 in Clearwater when we don't know as much about the teams early in the season? Your reaction to that question is what?
Yeah, so that was so now you hit on all 3 points of contention in well done with your investigative journalism. So this was the other thing is how do you evaluate a team that you in theory don't know anything about, right? Especially in the age of the portal, right? You can say, oh, well, they return 12 starters from last year, right? But now transfer portal, all these things. So how we ended up doing it was you kind of have what we thought about was you have 2 approaches to this. One is you say everybody's even, right? We're all average teams until proven otherwise. You guys have been around the sport, that that's actually not the case, right? There are teams that are consistently at the bottom of the pack, and there are consistently teams that are at the top of the pack. We know that intuitively, but how do I measure that? And so what we did was we looked at the number of runs scored and allowed in non-conference games over the last 3 years. And so again, using that Pythagorean formula that we talked about earlier, is we came up with a what a winning percentage should have been, right, in non-conference games. And so that's where so that was our starting point. And then we kind of compressed everybody towards the middle. And the idea is that you're never as good as you were last year, and you're never as bad as you were last year. But we know, that Oklahoma is probably going to be near the top of the rankings this year, right? There's no reason for me to put them at the same starting position as a team not named Oklahoma, right? Take your pick. And so that was something that we did, and we tried it, and it turns out. So, and this is where I'm going to bring in some math, and I'm sorry, but I have to. So when you make a predictive model, there's something called an R squared, or a correlation coefficient. And what that does is it says how much of the result is explained by the inputs. And so what I did was I said, where did you finish in DSR, and where did you start, right? We talked about how we got to where we started, right? Was the Pythagorean non-conference record. And turns out that starting place explained 74% of why you ended up where you ended up. So that's what gave us confidence that this was a sound methodology. Is it perfect? No. Again, I would certainly welcome any other ideas on how to do that better. But we felt pretty good that where people started and where they ended um, was pretty close.
Yeah. And I'm going to go back to the word I could not come to, the transparency part of this. So to that whole point, teams start at slightly different places at the beginning of the year. And so let's say at the end of the year, this is used by the selection committee and they see where a team ends. And there's some teams that are really close to each other. You can go and look at just this year's raw DSR points to just see how those 4 teams that you're looking at did for just this year to compare, not where they started, but just that year. And I think being able to transparently see, obviously your history affects where you start, but then when those teams are close together at the end, you can actually see who had the better year. And, like I said, and vary what you believe, it's just a tool. It doesn't have to be the end all be all, but I think using it as a tool to be able to then compare a just flat out raw DSR for the year can give you a good idea of where those teams should be that are really close together.
It's very similar to Ken Pom. For those that don't know college basketball, a lot of the college basketball media reference Ken Pomeroy and Ken Pom as reference of where the teams rank because they put a lot of how they perform offensively, defensively, a score margin of victory, things like that. That okay, how do they compare to what we're seeing on the court? I mean, that's the beauty of it. There's always data you can come up with. I'm curious, Beth, what has been the reaction to the coaches that you've talked to? Because I'm sure you've talked to them about the DSR. What's been the common feedback you get? Maybe some questions you've gotten from coaches that they may have. But what's been the feedback you've gotten when you've talked to other coaches in the sport about DSR?
I think a lot of the just comments and, feedback is just excited that somebody is an advocate for the diamond sports enough to create something for diamond sports. We are not basketball. We are not volleyball. We are not football. They are not the same sports. They should not be ranked in the same system as each other. And I think just that is an exciting thing for a coach, knowing this is built just for our sport. And even to the pitching aspect of softball being a little different than baseball, it is just built for softball. And then baseball is just built for baseball. And it's transparent. And so they love the fact that we can go into DSR and show them, if you want to know why you ended up here, we can go through every single game and you can see when you won 10 points, when you lost 5, when this happened, your peaks and your valleys and where it happened in the season. I'm sure I'll get more feedback at the end of the year now that it's going through. I mean, as a coach, you're like this right now. So, coaches are more worried about winning more than anything right now. Because I think on the DSR point, RPI, winning does matter in RPI, not as heavily as it does in DSR. But I think coaches will be much more aware of this ranking system throughout the season if it becomes what we're using than the RPI, because winning matters. Like, you have to win in DSR. Whereas RPI, if you schedule well, you can almost just, ride out your schedule. Just play okay, and my schedule is going to keep me above water. So, I think the feedback's been really good. I think now that this is going to have a full season under its belt, I think the feedback like a summer and having conversations on the time series and being able to go back and look at how their team progressed through a year and where they started and ended and all that is going to be really helpful.
The interesting feedback that I always chuckle with this is, Beth knows everybody at the, she's played and coached with everybody, and, so they all come up to her and they give big hugs, and then they say, what's this DSR thing? And then she brings them over to me, and, they say, and so we talk about it, and they're like, okay, cool. So what do I do? Like, so how do I do it? And I'm like, you win. And they're like, no, but like, how do I schedule? Like, who should I play under this system? And I was like, play the best team that you think you can beat. Well,
Yeah.
but how do I play like really good teams, or do I play bad teams? I'm like, And so it's funny because people are so in this paradigm of like, I got to schedule correctly. And I'm like, no, if you just win, everything else will take care of itself. And, like, you got to come up with a better answer than that, because you can't go tell coaches that all they have to do is win. Like, that's not a good answer for them. And I was like, sorry, that's like, that's how the system's set up, is there's not a way, at least that we found, to game it quite yet. So, but I thought that was really
no. It's 100% right, Beth. That's exactly how everybody's thinking, is right, the scheduling thing, and it's not just a softball thing. This conversation takes place in basketball, it takes place in volleyball, it takes place in all these other sports, and that's why you made an interesting point just moments ago there, Beth. And I want kind of Forrest to even expand on it. The DSR is exclusively formula for softball, and then it's a separate formula for baseball. You can't use DSR, for example, on basketball. That's why KenPom is something that college basketball people use, because that's strictly basketball. Is that where part of the problem is also with the RPI, is that they try to enforce this on every sport when it's very questionable that it even works for one particular sport, right? Even KPI to that example. Forrest, kind of expand on that, because I think that's a great point to bring up and remind people the whole purpose of this, for you to create this, is this is supposed to judge just softball. You can't judge a softball team compared to a basketball team. They're different sports, literally. So I kind of expanded, because I thought that was a great point there that Beth made.
Yeah, and I think you alluded to it earlier, right? I mean, this was a system RPI was a system that was built for basketball 40 years ago, and I think it was 1981. So our sport is deserving of something that's tailored to our sport, right? And even within, we call it diamond sports rankings, but there's even within diamond sports, those are different. So we want something, uniquely suited to, to our sport. And, I remember, because things like this idea of, because you try to look at other systems, right, and take where you can, and right, this idea of efficiency is very popular in football and basketball, right? Offensive efficiency, and it's like, I don't think the concept of efficiency applies to baseball, right? Or to softball. There's no clock, so I can't be, because efficiency is all about time, right? Time is a core part of efficiency. We don't have time, so like I can't use efficiency. Like that's not an applicable metric for our sport. So why do I? So I think that's just one example of just trying to, it's like, damn it, like we are good enough to have our own ranking system. We deserve that. Like, people work way too hard, to miss their chance to play for a championship, right? Because, we're not willing or able to come up with a system that rewards the most deserving teams. And I just, to hear quite frankly, the frustration and the pain that Beth felt firsthand, over trying to do the right thing, winning all the games, but then not getting a chance at the end. I don't know. It was really motivating for me, to hear those stories and say, like, we can do better. Like our sport deserves better.
Oh, well said. That's very good. Couple things, we'll let you go. We've gone a while. I warned you, Beth. We're gonna go a long time. But
I'll talk softball all day. You're never.
It's really good. But Forrest, one thing that I really like about you is you don't hide from, like, hey, comparing it to the RPI, for example, and things like that. You compare. You'll say, hey, this is what it looks like according to the RPI. This is what we have here in the DSR. Take me through that, because you're not one that, sometimes people are like, well, we don't even acknowledge the, we're just going to nitpick. You don't do that, for the record. I want to make sure people realize you're not just picking apart the RPI because, hey, we want you to be on these. These are legitimate points that you have. That doesn't mean you think that everything is bad about the RPI. It's just little differences in there. So just kind of expand on that, because you looked at KPI and RPI as well, and you compare it a lot of times to DSR.
Sure. And again, I think from it was a really helpful tool for a really long time. And, I think, hopefully, I'm not worse now than I was 40 years ago, but I think some things they run its course. I think, hugely influential in the development of DSR was this idea of strength of schedule. And that's a cornerstone, I think, of RPI. When people think of RPI, they immediately think of strength of schedule. And so we did want to leverage and keep that part of it, right? Winning percentage, that's 25% of RPI. And so we kept that too. We tweaked how important each of them were. And so the other thing too is that everybody understands that RPI is the tool that the selection committee has available to them. If we are proposing a replacement, then we have to compare ourselves to it, right? And like we talked about earlier, I can't say that DSR wins or DSR is more accurate or more correct, because there is no correct, right? I mean, it's you and Beth and the selection committee and all the softball experts that I've had so much fun talking to over the past 6 months on this thing. Y'all have to believe it, and it has to be credible. And in order for us to gain credibility, I have to show how it compares. And if we don't, if I let somebody else control the narrative, then they get to pick what they want to talk about, right? For us, it's, hey, I want to tell you everything that's in here. I want to tell you how much it matters. I want to show you how it compares to the current thing. And then I also want to tell you the rationale of why we excluded things like starting pitcher. Why did we cap, margin of victory at 10 runs, right? We want to be transparent about things. And so, both you and Beth made the point earlier is that we don't even consider this as like the end all be all. The selection process should not be fully automated, right? Nobody should sort by DSR, chop it off at 64 and say, okay, here's the field, right? This is meant to be a tool to help people because, the selection committee may know, that somebody's grandmother died last weekend, right? And she was struggling on the mound, right? Someone's boyfriend or girlfriend broke up with them, right? These are people. These are not, as much as I want them to be stat producing robots, they are not, right? They're real people with real lives, and all those things happen. And no model will ever be able to understand and contextualize all the things that happen to people over the course of a season. And so to Beth's point, right, when you can say LSU lost this game on this date and it was done by, and this many points were subtracted from their total, somebody says, yeah, the whole team had the flu, right? So maybe let's adjust that a little bit, right? And this just becomes a tool to help people. So that's ultimately, what we want to be is we want to allow people to make informed choices. We don't want to tell them what to do or how to do their jobs. We want to give them tools. That's sort of been a philosophy at our company, right? Is that we don't want to tell you where to put your defender. We want to give you the data and let you coach. And yet you decide, your players, your opposition. We know data. We know how to visualize it. We want you to make informed decisions. And this is, I think, consistent with that mantra, and to help the committee members who have a almost impossible job, right? No one comes out of the selection show and says, you know what, those committee guys did a great job this year. No way, that's been said 0 times ever. Right. So we want to give them a tool and at least say, hey, we made this decision and here's the criteria that we use to make it.
I think Sandy Atkins, if she's listening, will disagree. She felt that her committee that in 22 got a lot of praise that year. But you're right. Most of the times they don't get that. And maybe I'm at fault at times because I get emotional on some of the disagreements that we have, even though it is human.
But that's what you want, right? You want passionate people involved in this, right? Because if nobody cares, then you're not doing podcasts, and I don't have work, and everyone's sad.
Well, in full disclosure for those in the audience, obviously I write a bracketology for D1 softball. My job is to show what I think the committee will do. One of the things I've been using the last few weeks with your help, Forrest, and you're very kind because I bug you on Mondays about it, is you sent me some of the data where you compare the RPI to the DSR across the board, whether it comes to hosting, whether it comes to the bubble, which helps me get more data information because at the end of the day, they're all numbers, but a human being's going to have a committee of human beings are going to make a decision on who makes the field at the end of the day. It's all about what do you prefer? Is it a schedule? Because this team plays a schedule strength, and the thing I like is you provide all of that information together, so I don't have to go to like multiple pages to figure out everything. It's all there, and I think you did, credit to you for that. Because that makes the job easier. And I can see a pattern here. Oh, there's a difference here. Let me look into this even more now. Why there is a difference, and I think that's at the end of the day, we want the best possible job to be done for picking the right teams with the right data. And whether it's exclusively changing the RPI coming to DSR or including it with it, however the committees wants to do it, the NCAA wants to do it, I personally think, hey, if you want to have more data, great. But let's get it, make sure it's accurate there. Let me. This will be your last thoughts before we wrap up. Beth, I'll start with you. If you were in front of the NCAA, people that help make the decision for the committee, is like, okay, we will allow DSR to be a part of the process for the committee to use as a data point, to use that as a data to field the field of 64, to host and everything. Because you and I have friends that work in the committee, so they always get uptight, right? Because they always feel like they're being under attack every time. That's one thing, we're not doing this to under attack them. But what would you say if you were in front of them in the off season and say, this is why you need to include the DSR into this process?
Well, I'm going to keep using the word transparency because it is transparent. I think you can see a full team's resume to every data point of a team's resume throughout the year. I think that is unique. And it's just an extra tool. Like, to Forrest's point, we're not trying to say this is the end all be all, but this is a modern ranking system built just for diving sports that is transparent. And why would you not want to have that as a tool? I mean, and so I think that's what it is, having it as whether it's an extra tool or one of the tools in the tool chest to help you make the most data-driven decision. Because I do think, when you can base everything in data, you're doing a pretty good job.
Forrest?
I think, so often this comes down to, I read, I read, your bracketology and other prognosticators, and it's just really fun. And the thing that strikes me about what you guys do is you always include the last 4 in and the last 4 out. And what this does is it ends up being what you're doing is essentially you're comparing, in this case, 8 teams, right? And so what I think that DSR does is it really allows you to create an apples to apples comparison between 2 wildly different teams, right? To your point earlier, the 10th best team in the SEC versus the 3rd best team in the American, right? How do you compare those 2 teams? Because that's ultimately what you're doing, is you're trying to figure out, is it team A or team B, right? And so it's almost like a series of dyads, right? You're if this, then that, right? And then you kind of make it go down a list. And, for the most part, for the first 50 teams, I don't know, you know this better than anybody, right? At some point, it starts to get hard, right? And so what I want to do is say, rather than figure out how do you and the committee compare 250 teams to each other, let's triage that and allow you to focus in on the dozen to 2 dozen teams that are competing for, a dozen spots. And so for me, it's an optimization problem because I'd rather you spend a lot more time on a lot fewer teams rather than less time on more teams, because I feel like you get a better picture. So I feel like that this does a really good job of being able to create an apples to apples comparisons amongst very specific teams.
You can check out DSR. It's on D1softball.com. You go to the rankings page. It's there. You can check it out. It's updated daily.
Yep.
Correct? And it's same if you're a baseball fan, D1baseball.com. I go there too because check out baseball. Trust me. Folks, when they ranked UCF really high, I was skeptical. I'm like, wait a minute. UCF baseball top what? But you've been proven correct at this point for as the system works because they've having a great season there with Rich Wallace and company. So I think it's a great tool to use. That's also on D1baseball.com with our friends there if you're into baseball there. What else do you want people to know? Because I know you're still working on some stuff we're not going to get into because you're always trying to evolve and tweak some things as well, add some feature stuff that you and I have talked off air about. But what else can you want to tell the audience as far as if they want to get more information?
So yeah, so if you're into deep dive, there's a blog post at 643charts.com, and there's a blog section that goes into. It's about 4 or 5 pages. If you're having trouble sleeping at night or things like that, if you need something that puts numbers and graphs up there, you can check that blog out. Goes into a lot more detail about the concepts we talked about. The other thing as far as coming features, Beth referenced it earlier. At some point, and hopefully in the not too distant future on D1softball.com, we're going to put a time series graph. So think of like a stock price, right, where the x-axis is the date and the y-axis is your DSR rank. And you'll be able to watch day over day how a team has risen or fallen or stayed consistent over the course of the year. I know, Eric, you can speak to this probably better than anyone, right? Some people care a lot about like, where were you when you were your best? Like, what's your ceiling, or how well have you played in the last 30 days, right? All of these different types of things. So you can see a trend. And so what we'll be able to do is now you can put a UCF graph up and you can compare them with, with any team in the country, right? And see how, was that team ever higher than this other team, right? Where did they start, right? And so maybe you can look at, these teams are so far apart because they started so far apart, right? And so, so I think that will be a cool feature that will ultimately allow fans and media and prognosticators to really be able to compare teams over the course of the season to see where their peak and their valley was at a quick glance, and then also see what was, oh wow, look at that big drop in my line. What was that? Oh, that was when we got run ruled by a team that we should have beaten, right? Those kinds of things. So I think that's the thing I'm most excited about as a coming attraction for a DSR. I'm also excited to get feedback from people like you and other stakeholders about as this season progresses and we get to the selection show or the selection day and we say DSR got these right and these wrong, and then we go through that process again, like I went through with Beth, and I say, you tell me what I got wrong. And then, and then I figure out, okay, how do we fix this and make it better for next year?
I know that feeling very well as a bracketologist when people remind me of what I did right and did wrong on the picks. Don't worry, my counter argument, the difference is my counter argument is, well, I didn't get it wrong. They got it wrong. I disagree. But that's a whole other story. Forrest Allen, Beth Mullins joining us here on In the Circle on D1 Softball. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know this was a lengthy interview and podcast, process there, but I really wanted to get the word out about DSR. And I know there's been a lot of feedback and people have been wondering how it works and get to know it. And I appreciate both of you, first of all, your hard work on this, trying to help the sport, and number two, taking the time to explain it from so many different point of views and answering all the questions that I have. And like I said, this was fun. And like I said, as you know, I follow it every day. So for both baseball and softball. So I would recommend it even if you're not a softball fan, for baseball fans as well from there. So, but thank you both of you for taking the time from a busy schedule to join us and talk to us about DSR.
I appreciate it, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and thank you for your willingness to dive in. This is not obviously something you can kind of glaze over. So the fact that you've been willing to take as much time and bring this to your audience and to your listeners, we're very grateful for that. So thank you very much.